growing, and the region is quickly becoming energy self-sufficient. Politics aside, the region boasts energy resources of sufficient quantity that serious analysts have begun to suggest that a strategic realignment may even be underway from the Middle East to the Americas. That's a dramatic statement, but it's not fanciful. No less an authority than Dan Jurgen has written on this topic, and the Americas Quarterly, the flagship journal of the American Society and the Council of the Americas, devoted its most recent issue to these matters. And for those who may be interested, we have copies of that edition in the back, free of charge, so get your copy now and hopefully subscribe to it later on. But the problem is that when it comes to energy in the Americas, you can never put politics aside. In fact, in many cases, it's all about politics. Even with sufficient resources, the region will suffer if political currents and decisions hamstring the ability of operators to finance, develop, and utilize existing resources effectively. With that in mind, the Council has established the Energy Action Group in partnership with the Inter-American Development Bank and others to investigate energy issues in the Americas and to offer sound strategies to take advantage of opportunities and to address difficulties. Since 2007, in fact, the EAG, as we call it, has played an important role in the hemispheric energy debate. And we've hosted high-level meetings across the hemisphere, bringing together members of the public and private sectors to exchange views and offer well-received recommendations. Of course, Brazil is absolutely critical to this effort due to its economic size, geographic position, and standing as a nation whose policies are often emulated by others in the region. Energy is also critical to the Brazilian narrative, from scarcity in the 1970s, which led to the creation of the ethanol industry, to finding a balance between energy production and environmental protection in the Amazon region, to the recent deepwater finds which have the potential to transform Brazil into a global energy superpower. In fact, the country has just confirmed that it will auction the huge Libra offshore field, estimated to hold up to 12 billion barrels of oil, on October 21st. Clearly, we're not the only ones who have noticed. In recent months, the President and many members of his cabinet have traveled to Brazil, most recently the Secretaries of State and Energy. And the Brazilian President is scheduled to travel again to Washington for a state visit on October 23rd. Without any doubt, the U.S.-Brazil energy relationship will continue to be a significant and growing part of the bilateral dialogue. With this in mind, we've sought from the Council of the Americas perspective to lend our voices to understanding the issues confronting the development of Brazil's energy sector and to offer some collective views of the private sector. The report we are releasing today provides an overview of Brazilian energy issues with recommendations for further development. It's not designed to be an exhaustive report, but rather a snapshot of pertinent topics to be considered constructively as Brazil moves ahead into the next phase of energy sector development. It stems from high-level meetings we conducted in Brasilia in June and from various additional meetings that we've conducted over time. And one of the reasons why we have been so effective, we believe, in pulling together meaningful conversations on hemispheric issues is because, of course, we have the support of the IDB, but also due in part to the fact that the chair of our group is Rob Mosbacher. Rob's well known here in Washington and in international development circles, given his tenure as president of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation from 2005 to 2009. But what some of you may not know is that Rob is an accomplished business leader with more than 30 years in the energy sector. He's the chairman of Mosbacher Energy Company, where he previously served as president and CEO. He's also been the vice chairman of the Mosbacher Power Group and has been a director of the Calpine Corporation since 2009. He's also been very active as a leader in the greater Houston community, and I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention that Rob is on the board of the Americas Society, among other for-profit and non-profit boards, the sister organization of the Council of the Americas. There aren't many people who bring such an impressive understanding of both the technical aspects of the energy sector and also its complicated political aspects. Rob does both, and we are delighted that he's here this morning to offer some initial thoughts prior to our panel discussion, which he will then join. And so to begin our conversation on Brazil energy, the path forward, ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming the chairman of Mosbacher Energy and the chairman of the Energy Action Group of the Council of the Americas, Rob Mosbacher.
Eric, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Delighted to be here. This is indeed an exciting time in the energy world. My father left New York in 1949 to go pursue an opportunity in the oil and gas business in Texas at a time right after World War II when the energy business, and particularly the oil and gas business, was just beginning to take off in the southwestern part of the United States. And so I grew up in that business. And I can say without equivocation, in the really 50-plus years I've been watching this, and I've been working in it for over 35, there are a few times that have been as fluid or as exciting or hold as much potential. And by that I mean the whole shale revolution. I'd say, next to perhaps the emergence of OPEC as a cartel and as an influence on the supply and price of oil, the shale revolution is the single most important development that I've seen in my lifetime. And so not only is it an exciting time globally in terms of energy, but it's an exciting time in terms of this hemisphere, in terms of the Americas, and in terms of Brazil, and in terms of Canada, and the United States, and Colombia, and Mexico, on down to Brazil. And so there are all sorts of opportunities, and they're not just carbon or thermal opportunities. They're opportunities to help support, complement, reinforce investment in renewable energy as well. So it is a good, exciting time, and I was delighted to be asked to chair the Energy Action Group at Council of the Americas, and I was also pleased to be part of this meeting that we held in Brasilia in June. And it was actually a very thorough evaluation of not just carbon-based or oil and gas-based energy, both conventional and unconventional, but also renewable energy. And so we heard from, of course, energy companies, energy experts, regulators, multilateral institutions, the Brazilian government, and heard a wide variety of points of view. And you're going to have a chance to see many of those reflected in the report that Christian Gomez here helped draft for Council of the Americas that I hope you picked up a copy of. And I'd say in terms of the strategic dialogue between Brazil and the United States, even going back to my time in government, I know the United States government for the longest time has had deep respect and admiration for what the Brazilian government has done on the renewable energy side, particularly in terms of biomass, biofuels, and how to effectively utilize ethanol. And I think that given the opportunities that now have been discovered and lie ahead, not just in Brazil, but again, throughout the Americas, we are compelled, perhaps more than ever, to share best practices throughout the Americas, if not the world, on drilling and completion techniques, on issues of water utilization and field emissions. These are all things that the energy industry needs to focus aggressively on, and is. Because I'd say, as someone that's been in that industry a long time, we see the shale revolution as an extraordinary opportunity, but to be managed carefully and to be done very diligently. And that means not just the manner in which hydraulic fracturing is done, but also how much fluid is used in terms of water resource, how that is recycled or what have you, how we minimize emissions of either methane gas or even diesel fumes at the well site. These are all things that are manageable, and I think the industry is focused on. But it's a good time to share that knowledge throughout the hemisphere, and particularly in the context of the U.S.-Brazilian dialogue. So I think it's an exciting time. And Brazil, need to tell you all, is blessed with abundant resources. The oil and gas part I'll come back to in a minute, but here's a country that has 80+% of its power generated by hydro, and has significant both wind and solar opportunities that lie before it. And then going back to the oil and gas sector, not just huge oil reserves, but also significant unconventional gas reserves, which we don't even know how large they are. They could be as big or bigger even than the pre-salt in terms of ultimate size. So Brazil is faced with a variety of blessings, but also challenged. And what we heard and what I hear as an oil and gas individual is that there's always this creative tension between, how much of this sort of wealth are we going to maintain ourselves as a government and as a society, and how much are we prepared to share in the interest of sharing risk and cost. And so to me, the biggest challenge facing the Brazilians in terms of particularly the pre-salt, which is, of course, the mother lode, is the question of how much risk, how much cost are they prepared to share. It's extraordinarily expensive and risky to drill these wells because of the depth and because of the formations through which you go to get to this these pre-salt reserves. And yet the Brazilian government at the moment has at least indicated a position which I think may prove to be disadvantageous. And that is that they want to operate every well, have a 30% working interest, and basically be the principal sort of coordinator and player in this whole development. And I would quickly add, not only is it extremely expensive and complex, but even the wealthiest oil companies in the world, I don't think would say, we'll take full 100% responsibility for drilling every well and taking the risk as the operator of every single well. It's just good common practice in the oil and gas business. And even my tiny little company, relative to some of these other big companies, we don't drill wells heads up. In other words, we don't take a position of drilling a well where we own 100% of the well unless it's a development play. In other words, it's something that's long since been established, and then we're just doing it to produce the resource. But something that's really an exploration play is something where we share risk. And so I'd say that the fact that the Brazilian government is not sharing that operational risk, I think could come back to be a problem and haunt them. For one thing, there's the issue of how many rigs are available. And again, very expensive pieces of equipment. You have to, of course, build these things. They're not all sitting there ready to be deployed. And so that involves an investment. And all these investments are coming at a time when we have witnessed public demonstrations across the country of Brazil, and kind of a common cry for more commitment of resources to schools and healthcare facilities, better services. So at the very time that the Brazilian government may be banking on using a disproportionate share of revenues that are generated from their energy sector to play the role of developer and the operator of these wells, there's going to be a real tug of war going on between the legislators and the executive branch, as well as the energy ministry, or Petrobras, because they're going to want the resources to develop the oil as quickly as possible, and the government's making commitments to improve social services and other services that are very cost-intensive as well. So I think that's a tension that's not going to end up resulting in timely development of this resource the way the Brazilians would like. And you don't have to be in Brazil long to know that state governments are already spending money that they anticipate getting from a field or fields that have yet to be put on production in terms of any size and significance. So that's a real challenge and a real problem. And I mentioned the long lead times as well. So I hope, and this is something we heard, I hope that the Brazilian government will watch how the bids go on October 21st. They may be right. They may get some in the industry that are prepared to, in effect, finance a large part of the development of these pre-salt reserves. And they may find that nobody's complaining, at least among those who show up at the game. But I think there are a whole lot of others that would be at the game if they thought the terms were better. The other problem is, again, a perfectly understandable one from a political standpoint, local content. And, we see this in the energy industry all over the world, as you do in certain other industries. There is a understandable desire on the part of local politicians and you know, the local business community to maximize the local content involved in whether it's fabrication of pipe or valves or rigs or whatever it is, wind turbine blades. It's understandable. But I am told, and again, I haven't been involved in terms of trying to do this myself, that the local content requirements that the Brazilians are talking about not only have discouraged some companies from getting into the country because of both the cost, time, and so forth, or requirements of local content, but also are going to have the impact of discouraging bidding, because companies will look at it and simply say, we can't play by those rules. So I guess coming out of our study, I'd say that you know, we would urge the Brazilian government to proceed cautiously, see whether or not the concerns that we picked up in terms of the 30% working interest and the operatorship of each well, whether or not that ends up being as much of an impediment as I think it might be. I would ask them to be also fluid on the question of local content and see what's practical and what works and what's possible, and be prepared to adjust as you go along. Final piece, and I really don't want to get into the renewable area so much, although it has enormous potential, because we have others on the panel that really are more squarely in that space. But I think the unconventional potential is huge, meaning gas primarily, and that also takes a major commitment of resources in terms of infrastructure and knowledge. It's not something, as we have heard here in the United States, to be done lightly. It's something to be done very carefully, and it does require significant attention to oversee it and to see that it's done in the most responsible manner. And question I have for the government is, given the fact that that's not as strong an asset from a price standpoint as billions of barrels of oil, are you prepared to encourage that and to oversee it and manage it and regulate it as effectively as you need to in order for it to be developed responsibly? And so those are just some general thoughts. I think that, again, there's every reason in the world to be very encouraged about the future of Brazil's energy sector, but I think the government needs to figure out how to navigate its way through this very strong tension between the need for social services on the domestic side and the demands they're going to put on revenues to play the role that they've carved out from themselves on the operator side. So I look forward to participating in the conversation later on, and thank you all very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Rob. As promised, that was a terrific overview. And let's continue the conversation. If we could have the panel just come forward, we'll continue with that. If I could ask one favor, if everybody could please just turn off their cell phones, that would be appreciated. Thanks. All right. Having just talked about technological challenges in the Brazilian energy sector, we can talk about technological challenges here at the IDB and making sure we're mic'd up. But I think it's all working. We have a terrific panel that we've been able to assemble, and real expertise in oil and gas, real expertise in power generation, real expertise in alternatives. We've got government, we've got private sector, we've got think tank. But before we get into the panel, I also want to join Rob in giving a special thanks to Christian Gomez, who is the coordinator of our Energy Action Group, and he's the primary author of the report, and he's the one who's coordinated the activities, and I think has done a terrific job. So Christian, thank you for your efforts. And we are going to actually start our discussion with Christian very briefly going over the highlights of what you'll find in the report when, not if, but when you take a look through it and digest it. Hopefully you won't find any big surprises in there, but you may. Christian, why don't you give us a sense of some of the highlights of the report and what people can look forward to when they take a look at it?
Sure. So we had a terrific meeting back in June in Brasilia, which was alluded to, and as an output of these conversations, I drafted this report, and it's a bit comprehensive because I try and cover almost all aspects of the Brazil energy matrix, which can be a challenge. So I'll touch on a few of the highlights here. I'll start with the recommendations, and the first recommendation is that the production sharing contracts in oil and gas sector should balance the right amount of risk and profitability potential. And the reason why I was looking at this was that Brazil is going to be using a production sharing agreement system in the pre-salt auctions. And one of the reasons that this is being used is that generally concessions are used when the risk of finding oil is actually higher because the oil company is actually given rights to the oil reserves. In this particular case, it wasn't considered as risky because 70% of the wells that were drilled by Petrobras actually were found to have oil in them. So in order to sort of balance the right amount of profit and risk, this is the stance that we have for that. Second is natural gas. And I think natural gas is really an important area of the matrix that is not being fully taken advantage of. Hydropower amounts for more than 80% of Brazil's electricity matrix, but there can be droughts. And I talk about this in the paper. Thermal energy should be available to fill in those gaps, but also natural gas is a compelling, cleaner feedstock for the future. And we talked about the shale gas revolution, and I think some of the factors in the shale gas revolution that we see in North America are smaller, nimble operators that are able to move quickly, and they're able to have land and mineral rights for exploration. And so this is, do we see this as a possibility in Brazil for this type of revolution to occur? I think it's going to be very difficult, and I think they're going to have to approach this with a different model. Third recommendation was that Brazil should pursue policies towards the development of sugar and second-generation biofuels. In this case, ethanol has sort of been on a roller coaster ride for the past 7 or 8 years. 2006, you saw a lot of resources investment going to ethanol. You saw the financial crisis in 2008, and you saw credit vanishing from the ethanol industry. A lot of the sugar mills that are producing ethanol and sugar were actually being shuttered, and it was very much a challenging point. And I think the interesting thing is most sugar mills have the ability to produce ethanol or sugar depending on which price was higher. In recent months, you are seeing more of a diverting of resources to the production of ethanol, but this has been and continues to be a challenge. Next recommendation was talked about hydropower. I mentioned this already. Thermal power must be available to fill in gaps. It's an intermittent power source. I also want to point to some of these large hydro projects in the country. There is obviously an environmental piece that needs to be considered. A lot of communities in the Amazon are kind of making their voices heard in terms of these sorts of issues, and I think that those should be considered very carefully. Second to last point is on the renewable side, wind and solar. I think you're seeing a lot of roadblocks in development of this sector because of the local content, and Rob already touched on it. A lot of the wind auctions that occurred in 2009 are actually only about 15 to 30% of these projects are actually coming online. So while Brazil has seen an increase in installed capacity from about 300 megawatts to today just over 2,500 megawatts, you are seeing projects kind of coming to not being fully realized. And I would just point to the fact that a lot of these manufacturers, they're forced to actually buy their wind turbines in Brazil, which add to the cost of doing business and makes some projects financially unsustainable. The last point I want to bring up is regulatory issues, because one of the things that you see in Brazil is that regulatory issues kind of are in flux. You see a lot of changes in kind of a regulatory policy that governs the energy sector. This makes it difficult to achieve investor certainty, and I think certainty is absolutely needed in Brazil in order to make the energy sector more competitive. And Brazil's competitiveness is not guaranteed, but the resources are there. I think it's just sort of going to take the policies that need to get us there. So those are sort of the recommendations that I looked at in the report. I hope you read it. I welcome your comments, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you for that overview. You have the bios of all of the panelists in the program notes, so I'm not going to go deeply into the bios at all. But let me turn to our next panelist, Ramón Espinasa, who's here at the IDB. I actually first met Ramón in about 1995 when he was the chief economist at PDVSA.
We were in high school at the time.
We were in high school at the time. He is one of the smartest people in terms of oil and gas in the Western Hemisphere that I think there is, and it's a delight to have you on the panel and to be a partner with you in this project. So if I could ask you to, pun intended, drill down a little bit and help us understand more on the oil and gas side in Brazil, that would be very helpful.
Thank you, Eric, very much. Since I am the IDB representative in the panel, I should start by welcoming you all to our premises today. Thank you for coming. Second, thank you to the Council of the Americas for organizing both the seminar in Brasilia and this seminar in DC for disseminating the things we discussed there and keeping the ball rolling. I would like to thank you, Rob, Eric, and Christian, particularly for being in Brasilia, organizing the meeting, and being now here. Third, I should welcome a group of students from the Foreign Service Institute. They were supposed to come. This was a meeting organized months ago, and it was today. And they were supposed to listen to me, but you'd rather listen to this panel. You will learn much more about Latin America. Then welcome. Fourth, I want to particularly welcome Professor Rafael Rangel. He was for more than 20 years the president of arguably the best university in Latin America, el Instituto Tecnológico de Monterrey, and now he's a personal advisor to the president of the Arizona State University. And I welcome you, Rafael. Once I have fulfilled my PR duties, I'll move into what Eric asked. The future looks great, as Rob mentioned and Eric said, but the reality is different, as Christian quite rightly points out in his excellent, I've really read it the last 2 days, and it's very well written piece. Far from increasing, oil production in Brazil has been falling over the last year and a half. And not by small amounts. Production has fallen by almost 15%, crude oil production, from close to 2.7 million barrels per day in 2011 to the latest figure in April is 2.3 million barrels per day. Then again, the future looks great, but the reality is quite different. The reason for this is that investment has been falling, and as measured by active drilling rigs, drilling activity in Brazil has fallen from 80 active drilling rigs daily, the count in 2011, to 67 is the latest in July this year. Then there is something that is preventing investment and is pushing oil production down in Brazil. I'm going to elaborate on that, but that's a fact. Brazil is not alone in that regard. It has the company of the other two best performing countries in the oil sector in Latin America over the last 15 years. These three countries, Brazil, Peru, and Colombia, have done extremely well up to very recently. And something has happened that has hampered activity and production. Drilling activity has fallen in Colombia by almost 20% over the last year and a half, and it has fallen also in Peru. When analyzing the reasons for this, I believe there are some commonalities and also some particularities to these three countries. But the commonalities I have heard in my frequent trips to the region, I have been to the three countries over the last 3 months. I have talked to colleagues in the oil sector. One of the reasons is slowdown in environmental permits. That's the case for sure in Colombia and Peru, and I believe it's also the case in Brazil. And it's not just, or it's not because of more stringent environmental restrictions, but the agencies as such don't have the bureaucratic capacity to process all the environmental permits. At least that is the case in Colombia and Peru again. It's taken as much as 18 months to process a permit. Once you have the equipment inside, and that means huge losses and slows down the process. The second that I'm pretty certain is common to the three countries is that they are running out of new areas for bidding. This is a very, I'll use a technical term, so it's a very Ricardian in terms of David Ricardo model, in the sense that you give away, when you open your oil sector, you first give out for exploration your best areas. And then there is this tail of the less productive fields. And that's what the Colombia, Peru, and Brazil have been opening up. Then you had this huge increase in activity since prices began going up in the mid-2000s, in 2003 or 4. Then you had this sharp exponential increase in production in the three countries, and now it's slowing down because you have less productive areas coming on stream. And Brazil, until the 11th round, Augusto, you correct me, in March, the latest round was in 2008. Then there were no new areas in Brazil. That is the case in Colombia and also in Peru. Then back to Brazil, and as I think Rob pointed out extremely well, you are creating expectations that reality is not supporting. And I think, looking at both the oil sector performance, but also the political situation in Brazil, I think the most demanding task now has to be on the part of the authorities to modulate expectations. Because you're creating this idea that the country is very wealthy, that has plentiful of resources, but you are putting all your eggs in a single basket, which is the pre-salt. And you will not have a barrel out of the pre-salt before, if everything goes well, I mean, this is a speculation, but I would say it will take some time, between 7 and 10 years, to have production on stream from these very complex areas. And this is pretty unique development. This is even more complex than the North Sea, let alone the Gulf of Mexico deep water. This is deep water and deep drilling through a dome of salt that hasn't been drilled commercially before. Then you will have open seas operations in the mid of the Atlantic Ocean in these very complex areas. Then it will take time. Of course, you will have wealth creation before production comes on stream because the investments will be there. But it is not until October 24th that they will open the envelopes for Libra. And we'll have to see how it comes. And I just want to underline the 2 or 3 aspects Rob mentioned. First is monopoly of production with a 30% working interest to Petrobras. Petrobras is running thin, and that's the reason production is falling. Then you're putting on top of Petrobras all this responsibility, huge demands in terms of manpower, engineering capacity, operations for developing these very complex areas. I have heard from my Brazilian colleagues, former, not the people in Petrobras now, but former Petrobras, saying that that's asking too much from Petrobras, just from operational standpoint, let alone what you mentioned, Rob, the risks themselves. What you mentioned, how many rigs are available? There is shortage of rigs worldwide, and then you are asking that some 75% of this equipment to be produced, manufactured in Brazil, and that's putting huge pressure on the Brazilian manufacturing sector that may slow down the process. Then the future looks great, but the transition between the now and the future is not that bright, looks rather gloomy. Production, again, far from increasing, is coming down. At most, will level out at this point, but you will require huge investments to develop the pre-salt, and the conditions are not the most favorable. At a seminar organized by the State Department in DC in April this year, I heard for the first time a Brazilian word that Augusto Ponzi, that works with us, translated. It's jeito, the jeitinho, the jeitinho brasileiro. That's modeled through. I mean, find ways and means of doing things. I'm pretty sure the Brazilians will find their jeitinho for carrying this on, but it's not going to be an easy way forward. And from the political standpoint, if I could give just one piece of advice, would be modulate expectations. This will not come easy. It will take effort. It will take time. And I know why I say that, because we made that mistake in my country. I'm from Venezuela. And you can pay that dearly when you create expectations that don't come to fruition that fast.
Ramón, thank you. And before we go to the power generation side, and I ask Ambassador Oliveri to weigh in, Rob, you mentioned something in your setup comments which I found very interesting. I just want to get your reaction, and maybe Ramón as well. All of these things that you've pointed to, Ramón, I think most observers would agree with. But the piece that you also mentioned was the huge explosion of activity in North America, Rob. And I guess the question I would have, do you see the interest of companies going toward North America negatively impacting their interest in terms of South American countries that Ramón mentioned, or Brazil specifically? Or is there no direct relationship there, and we should not view that in a similar way?
Well, I think the size of the reserves are irresistible in terms of where you want to be if you're a major company with the resources to participate. But the industry will also look at what's the cost, lead time, and complexity of getting access to this, and what are the revenue streams going to be. And they may work their way through a whole lot of other better plays that are better constructed or organized. Colombia has one of the friendliest environments for by that I mean legal environments for working. So I think they'll go with the easier, lower entry cost, quicker production opportunities before they'll get to something that is longer lead time and more expensive, like Brazil.
Good point. So it's we're in a globally competitive industry here. We're not, perhaps, countries can't look at themselves in isolation. Yeah, thank you. Ambassador Oliveri, power generation is different from oil and gas, and so we have to change our hats a little bit, but obviously there's a relationship there. The ambassador is someone who has spent an entire career working in political and diplomatic activities, but also on energy activities from the political perspective. Now he's with Enel, which is Italy's largest power generation company, very active in South America, and also a good friend. So, Ambassador, how does the power generation sector look? What are the prospects in Brazil for that?
Well, let me start by complimenting our colleagues in the council for a very, very good job done.
Is your microphone?
Is it on?
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, okay.
I wanted everybody to hear that compliment, so I wanted to make sure the microphone was on.
It's certainly due to owed to you. Let me drag you a little bit from the dark underground to the surface and hopefully clear skies. We, as a group, we have heavily invested in Latin America through the acquisition of Endesa first, and then on our own, in part through the development that we are conducting in renewable sources, but not just that. And Brazil is certainly one of the countries in Latin America that sit at the top of our priority list. So let's start from that and say that basically there is nothing that I could not agree in your report in general terms. But I would interject some nuances.
Please.
One of them is that we are not as concerned as you seem to be on the regulatory side. What we do find, however, in Brazil is that there is a superposition of local, state, and federal regulations that make it difficult for the local administration to conduct their work through. I think that what Ramón said earlier is exactly right. That's what we find every day, and so forth. We also suffer a little bit from the issue of local contents. Our people in Brazil point that out to us, and that seemed to be a little bit of a handicap. But that does not change our general outlook. I mean, the reason we are in Brazil, the reason we are counting on Brazil as one of the leaders in our development policy, is that it is a unique country in this, that they have a tremendous amount of power generation that is hydro derived. This is a wonderful thing in terms of climate, in terms of environment protection, and so forth. At the same time, recent years have shown that it is a very vulnerable situation to have when there is not enough water to run all this. Which brings to the fore the issue of how to complement the generation they have with a new generation, additional generation, that can fuel the development of the country, and at the same time balances the existing capacity with sources that will be there when water is not available in the quantities that we are accustomed to. And that happens to be something that we think we can weigh in. Brazil is blessed with huge amounts of natural resources that allow for a development of renewable generation. We have concentrated so far mostly on wind generation for a number of reasons. One of them is that it appears to be incredibly competitive. Brazil is a place where our calculations are that we can generate electricity at a cost of some $43 per megawatt, which is a very attractive price. Solar is about 3 times as expensive as it is now, as of now in Brazil. So it is not as attractive, but we are trying to make it more competitive in the future. And of course, it would benefit from a policy that would make that easier. But even as it is, I mean, we have about 600 megawatts under contract or under construction with PPAs already obtained in Brazil through our newcomer on the market, which is Wind Power of Brazil. Now, let me say that we are, in general, very happy with the situation we found in Brazil in terms of local availability of human resources and the general acceptance of our presence in the country. Mostly our operations are centered in the state of Rio and nearby, but we have operation in different parts, in different states, including some thermal power, and we have some relatively large hydro that we have inherited from Endesa. But we are not only developing these sources, we are actually using Brazil as a platform where we can develop some of our cutting-edge technologies. We have started in Brazil near Rio in a place called Búzios. Anyone who is familiar with Rio knows Búzios. It's a very good choice. I don't know who made the decision to locate our project there, but I'm sure that our engineers love that. And we are building a smart city in Búzios with all the things that go with that. So you might think that we are looking here at the upper end of energy consumption. But at the same time, I'm happy to say that our people in Rio have done something which I've never seen in all my life anywhere. They have stepped into the favelas of Rio, and they have started a wonderful project designed to respond to a very real issue, which we had, which I'm sure everybody else also has in Brazil, which is energy stealing. Mm-hmm. You know, we used to lose some 50% or even more of our electricity to energy theft because people simply did not factor electricity as a cost. They just, hooked up to the cables and run whatever they wanted to run without any consideration to economy, to sparing sources, and so forth. So our local subsidiary there decided to go into the favelas. They hired people, young people in the favelas. They built a map of the users. They found out why those people were wasting energy. They managed to issue appliances, efficient appliances to them, like fridges and things like that, and they reduced immediately the amount of energy that was stolen. And after that, they tried to find ways for the people there to earn money that could be applied against their energy consumption. This thing is so good that we now employ some 20 sociologists. I mean, I think it's probably the only electric company in the world that hires sociologists. And the Brazilian government wanted, in fact, to nationalize it. But we are strongly resisting. We're very proud of this thing. So all this to say, we believe that Brazil has a brilliant future ahead. We believe that is a unique situation to profit from a overabundance of renewable resources, which we can help provide. I think there are, like probably more than 130, 140 gigawatts capacity in wind. And we have been unable to map the amount of solar capacity that would be there available for us if we could tap it. So I think there you have a great opportunity to provide Brazil with an alternative source that would not imply stepping back from the clean mix they have now, and it would integrate well with hydro, because basically, if you use renewable energy, you simply stop using hydroelectric power. You keep it in your dams, behind your dams, in your reservoirs, and you use it when the sun goes away. You use it when the wind dies down. So the integration is very good. There is room there for thermal generation as well. I think that's been pointed out that Brazil is sitting on huge reserves of gas. People who know a lot more than I do have spoken on this. I would not get into it. But certainly there is room for Brazil to use it. I would conclude by saying that I think the best thing that can happen is if Brazil manages to provide processing capability, I would say, to the administration at different level, so that time lag in authorization and in processing the different issues are mastered. This is particularly true in areas where we are actually breaking new ground, as it is in the case of shale gas, but certainly also, and this is in the case of renewable energy, because regulatory agencies are used to authorizing what they have been doing over decades. When we come up with solar projects or wind projects, they are not totally clear what they should be looking at, and that tends to be a little bit of a drag. So I think this is how we see things, and again, I can assure you that we are going to be putting all our energy into developing the enormous potential that Brazil has.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. It's very interesting comments. And one of the things you alluded to, and also came up actually in terms of the oil and gas, is a tremendous, I don't want to use the pun of saying power, but I'll say power anyway, the tremendous power of the energy sector to drive innovation broadly in an economy, not just in terms of technological innovation, which clearly you've referred to, but policy innovation. I mean, this idea of going into favelas and actually reducing energy usage by talking to the community and working with the community and actually reducing theft is something that is probably scalable throughout the region.
I should have mentioned a particularity that in Brazil, you pay tax on the energy you produce and deliver. It doesn't matter whether you get paid for it or not. So in a way, we're producing energy that was used by people who did not pay, and on top of that, we also had to pay taxes.
Yeah.
So I mean, there was a very powerful incentive to do something about it without, transforming people who were abusing the system into customers.
But it also has environmental implications because the best way to produce new energy is to not use the energy that is foregone. So, and that has environmental implications. Well, let's turn to that aspect in terms of renewable energy and environmental implications for our next panelist, Craig O'Connor, who has a long history on working on some of these issues and is also an adjunct professor at the Georgetown School of Business, where he teaches. Craig is with the Export-Import Bank and has a slightly different perspective, but a broader perspective perhaps. Why don't you give us a sense of some of the issues as you see them facing Brazil. And then after Craig talks, we do want to get the audience involved in this conversation. So I think we'll have some time prior to the conclusion of the panel for those of you who may have questions to step to the mic and be recognized, and then we can work with some of those questions. But Craig, over to you.
Well, thank you, Eric, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of the panel this morning. And I also want to compliment Christian on his excellent paper to really frame up the issues. So the Export-Import Bank, for those of you that may not be familiar with us, we were established in 1934 as a New Deal agency, independent agency of the U.S. government, sister agency to the agency that Mr. Mosbacher used to head, OPIC. So Ex-Im Bank was created during the Great Depression to provide financing to support the export of U.S.-made goods and services, but it was really to provide financing when financing was pretty scarce. And we had a silly old baseball manager that said it's like deja vu all over again. So occasionally when you think that these organizations should retire, the market comes back and proves you wrong. So we've been involved in Brazil for quite some time. In fact, the first loan I think we did was in 1941, a special deal between FDR and Getulio Vargas. We financed the Volta Redondo steel mill, which I think at the time was the first steel mill in the hemisphere. We've been involved in the energy sector for some time. I've been at the bank for about 20 years, and the first year that I was there, it's funny, the word jeitinho. Brazil was just coming off of its, what they call the lost decade of the 1980s, where because of the defaults, kind of overexpansion, there was not new lending. And so Brazil was just finishing its Paris Club obligations, and Ex-Im Bank wasn't quite yet open for the public sector, but we had a little project called CIVAM, which is a $1.3 billion project to monitor the rainforest. And so our then chairman, Ken Brody, figured out, well, we'll just make a loan to Banco do Brazil. Even though it's part of the state government, it's not a state agency. So that was his little jeitinho to do the work there. So in current exposure, we've got $3.3 billion loans outstanding. We don't have a minimum project size. We don't have a maximum project size. I like to tell people we're not in business to make money, but we also try not to lose money. So those of you, the U.S. taxpayers, will be pleased to know that we returned almost $1 billion to the Treasury last year. Some would argue maybe too much. Maybe you guys are too risk averse, but that's another discussion. And so Ex-Im Bank is congressionally chartered. Every 4 or 5 years or so, we get a new charter from Congress. And in 1992, Congress stipulated that Ex-Im Bank should increase its support for environmentally beneficial exports. What does that really mean? They talked a young loan officer into assuming the position of environmental liaison officer. We'll take this on with some of your other duties. That was me back in 1994. I was crazy enough to do it. In those days, it was a lot of geothermal. Today, it's a lot of wind. And, our lending in this space is mostly to the private sector. And so years ago, when I joined the bank, maybe 70% of our lending was to public sector. Today, it's totally reversed. It's probably 80% to the private sector, and we're looking at some projects with your colleagues with the now. And so, I think Eric mentioned it right from the outset. It's all about the politics, because that drives the policy and that drives the investment. So where we have been active, we've been active in Brazil. We financed a project, we financed wind blades. L&M of Denmark exported wind blades from the U.S. to a project that Grupo IMSA was sponsoring in Brazil, and that was about $32 million. We also financed a project that I'm very proud of. It's actually capturing the waste, the methane gas from the Jardim Gramacho landfill. And actually, there's a special on CNN. You can YouTube it. They're nominated for some award. Anyway, we financed a project to capture the gas, the methane gas, which, as you know, is probably 20 times more harmful to the atmosphere than CO2, taking the methane gas, using it as feedstock to Petrobras at a refinery, displacing 10% of the gas that they were using. And this is a deal we're pretty proud of. That's where there wasn't a lot of local content. I guess this is landfill gas is not considered a huge sector, although in certain aspects it is. Again, the policy about local content, it's admirable. As Rob mentioned, you want to create the jobs, you want to create the employment. But I think the way to do that is that what we've done in the United States, maybe not as consistently as some might like, but we've had a production tax credit where you go back to 2004, maybe we had one wind turbine manufacturer in the United States, GE. And GE bought that from Zahn, who bought it from Enron. Well, now you probably have 9 to 10 wind turbine manufacturers. You've got, I think, the U.S. and China change leads every year in terms of who has the biggest installed capacity for wind. A lot of it's driven by the states. Who knows what state in the United States has the largest installed capacity of wind? Nobody on the, yeah, Texas, exactly, right? It's an energy state, right? It's an energy state. The incentives are there. As Dr. Oliveira mentioned, the wind is very competitive in a lot of areas, but it's all about the policies. Do you have long-term PPA? Do you have incentives that can help equalize the cost of wind? I once had a question from one of our directors, is, well, when is wind going to be competitive with fossil fuel? I said it is today, except that fossil fuel doesn't pay its quote-unquote externalities that the economists could explain much better than I can. But that's where you're at. So even in a country like Honduras, where they're importing a lot of their fuel, they're not energy independent like Brazil. We financed the largest ever project in Honduras, and it was a Cerro de Hula project. I think it was the largest wind project in Latin America, in Central America, and at a cost of half of what Honduras was paying for conventional fuel. We've been very active in Uruguay. We just financed a project there. We have several more. We've been active in Mexico, a couple projects in Costa Rica and Peru. So I've mentioned all these countries, but I'm not really mentioning Brazil. A lot of it, again, has to do with the local cost, local content. I think there's a danger because it's there's no free lunch. And as my economics professor used to say, woefully for him, there's no free beer, right? So you're taxing somebody. If you've got local content, as you know, the cost of your turbines are going to be higher. Yeah, so the cost of his electricity is going to be higher. So that, the people in the favelas, okay, they're starting to pay again now, but it takes a bigger bite out of their income. Well, that's less money they can spend in the market. And so it benefits a certain contingent, but it doesn't benefit your group as a whole. And it also kind of locks you out of a lot of financing. So Exim Bank, along with other export credit agencies, we're not unique in the world. We all got together a few years ago and decided we should extend our support for renewable energy. So we're able to make an 18-year loan. Right now, our current fixed rate direct loan is 3.78%. It went up, I'm sorry. It used to be under 3%, right? So that's fixed rate, and that's great for project developers because they know what their cost is going to be. There may be some hedging costs you have to factor in, but if you have this open system, you can attract a lot of different types of financing where you're BNDES is great. Got a lot of respect for them. Second largest bank in the world, by the way, behind China Development Bank. But like Rob mentioned, resources aren't infinite. How much can they really finance? And should they be doing that? That's the other thing about what we look at in project finance is, have those that are in the best position to mitigate and take those risks to take that on. There's a lot of resources that could be channeled elsewhere. So we're keen to do more business in the renewable sector. I agree with you. I think it's a wonderful sector. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that years ago we financed part of the Itaipu Dam, and one of the engineers, Jim Mahoney, that worked on that project is still at Exim Bank. And so we've been involved in this sector for a long time. I'd like to be even more involved. And it just, you open it up to more competition, you crowd in more financing. Cost of energy is lower. Your overall industrial base is going to be more competitive. And if you have the policies, you'll get the investment. And the United States has proved that. So I guess that's in my comments.
Thank you, Craig. Very well said. And takes us, I think, to the next stage of this program, which is to say audience participation. So to the extent that those of you might have questions, we'll take a round of 2 or 3. Please direct the question to a specific panelist if indeed the question is directed to a panelist. Otherwise, I'll assign or ask somebody to answer. But microphones are here. We'll start here, please.
Good morning. My name is Lee Paddock. I'm Associate Dean for Environmental Law at George Washington University Law School, and we do some work with one of the law schools in Rio de Janeiro. And in fact, we're there last week talking about energy efficiency, and I noticed the report mentions energy efficiency briefly and talks about the Brazilian goal for energy efficiency. And I wonder if there's any perspective from the panelists about what's the state of implementation of energy efficiency other than in the favelas that were mentioned in Brazil now, and what kind of work, especially perhaps in the legal frameworks there, might be needed to advance energy efficiency.
Thank you. It's a very important question. Let's go to the gentleman behind you.
My name is Adam Victor. I'm president of Transgas Development, and I address this question, the first part of the question to Mr. Mosbacher, and the second part to anybody on the panel. And the question is, what do you consider the necessary price per barrel for oil, given the risk and the rate of return, assuming a 20% rate of return, that you need to have in order for these new projects to be financially viable? And secondly, how is that going to stack up with the fact that coal gasification is now coming in with prices about $65 a barrel equivalent for gasoline? And for the panel over here, is there a potential in Brazil and in other Latin American countries for coal gasification projects that will be making gasoline at about $65 a barrel equivalent?
Thank you very much. Is there a third, or we'll take these two, and then perhaps if there's time, go to a second round? Sure, please.
Hi, I'm Tana Farrington from the National Electrical Manufacturers Association, and my question is for Ambassador Oliveri. How do you see the current conditions for smart grid development in Brazil now and over the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, these are some great questions, and truthfully, I wish we had all morning to discuss energy in Brazil, and even that might not be enough. We're just getting a taste of some of the issues this morning and whetting our appetites, but we'll come back to the issues. We'll talk about them continually even after this morning. Why don't we start with the energy efficiency question? Some countries in the region have done a great job with that. Ambassador, you're in the power generation sector. Maybe you could start us off there. How's Brazil doing? You mentioned it a little bit, but more broadly, if you've got some thoughts about that. And then I'd also like to discuss the smart grid issue, and then we'll come to Rob in terms of the price per barrel, and Ramón.
Well, I'd be happy to. Well, the project that we started in Rio was, in fact, precisely centered on the idea of energy efficiency, because we understood that people needed to equate the use of energy with an expense, with a specific expense. Once you made that equation, they could understand energy efficiency, and at the same time, they would make allowance in their budgets for a reasonable expense for that. So that started in the schools, and obviously we're not in a position to create a policy for the whole country, but we are in a position to implement a policy in the area where we work, and that's why, as I alluded earlier, we really made an effort to keep control of that particular project, because we thought that we were in fact breaking new grounds in terms of creating this link between the two things. Having said that, of course, it is a very large issue, and it is connected with the smart grid issue too. Now, in Brazil, we have recently signed an agreement with a local company for the manufacture of smart meters. Smart meters are not all there is in a smart grid, but they're one of the indispensable ingredients, and is the first step. So that shows that we, as a group, put a very large price to large value to this particular initiative. Not many people know that Enel, as a group, has deployed more than 40 million smart meters. The entire customer base in Italy and Spain is either, like in Italy, for 10 years been using smart meters, or in the case of Spain, is now transitioning to them. And we are conducting similar introductory policies in Chile as well. And the reason we do that in Latin America is that Latin America is a fast developing country with, in general, a large issue of grid connection. And that is, in fact, I mean, if I could cap the entire presentation on Brazil, I would say that one thing that Brazilian policymakers may want to look at is to look at ways of facilitating grid connection for new generation in parts of Brazil that are right now out of reach. That's the key to developing renewable resources. So I think smart grids have a place in Latin America. In fact, you may wonder why we are investing in smart grid development in Latin America and not in the United States. And that would be a good subject for another panel, so I will not get into it. But I will only say that it is a conscious decision that we have made, and we are now working on it together with our Endesa colleagues with the object of developing and implementing smart grids in the countries in Latin America where we have a large presence in distribution, not just generation, but in distribution as well, which is basically for Chile, Colombia, Peru, Brazil, and to some extent Argentina, but those four.
But it's also an interesting example of how the use of technology and the use of clever policy can get at some of the bigger issues. For example, universal access to energy, which is a priority not just of the IDB, but frankly of the hemispheric community in terms of the Summit of the Americas. And this is very much a mandate of the leaders of the region to promote energy universality. And I think one of the things that we're finding is that the use of the application of this technology is leading to bigger goals.
I forgot to say something, and I really apologize for that, because here we are at the IDB, and we are working with IDB in areas that we hadn't touched before. In fact, we are seconding a geothermal energy expert to IDB so that the bank has first-hand access to expertise in that area where we think we are among the leading companies. Thank you.
Thank you. Christian, I think we have a topic for our next report, no? Smart grid technology and universal access and some of these issues. I think they're on the minds of many, including me. Let's go to the oil and gas question. Rob, you want to address that, and then Ramon to the...
Yeah, and I'd like to, perhaps Ramon has done some work on this. I'd say, first of all, the price per barrel you need is partly driven by the tax and regulatory framework that you're operating in, the cost of getting barrels to a market. I remember I was on the board years ago, and still am, of a company called Devon Energy, which is an active player in the oil sands, not on the surface, not the surface mine part of it, which is kind of horrific to see, but the in situ part, which is where 90+% of it's being produced. And we, at the time, when we got into this in the early part of the last decade, we said, well, price oil's got to be at least $35 a barrel for us to make this work economically. Since then, cost of drilling, cost of completion, cost of all these things have gone up. And the industry is very competitive from a service standpoint, and so you do see costs go up, and therefore the per barrel cost that you need to recover goes up. So I don't know if there's a magic figure on the pre-salt, but I'd say, at $100 a barrel, you should more than cover the cost. Now, there's a figure in the report, and Christian and I have talked about this, which suggests that ultimately it'll end up being about $15 a barrel of how much it costs. Well, that's sort of taking these huge investments you make up front and then sort of spreading it out over the production of 50 to 100 billion barrels, and that per barrel cost comes down. But at the beginning, it's considerably higher than that. So if I had to guess, I'd say you need something north of $65 a barrel, somewhere in there, but I haven't seen any particular research on it. So.
Any comments from either you, Rob, or Ramon, in terms of the coal gasification issue as well? Or?
Well, first of all, I think investment in coal gasification is probably going to lag as long as you've got gas that doesn't need to be extracted from coal. We're swimming in gas in the United States, and we're looking finally at investing in infrastructure to use it in transportation much more aggressively and other things. So I think coal gasification is something that's out there. I can't speak to being approached by many people about investing in that, because I think we've got a lot cheaper ways of getting gas to market and using it more efficiently without using coal.
Ramon?
Yeah, two comments. First, I want to make a comment on the efficiency issue, because we always think of efficiency in terms of from the demand side, bulbs and smart grids and the like. But there are huge gains to be made in efficiency from the supply side in worldwide and particularly in Latin America. And are the poorest countries in Central America and the Caribbean that are generating the dearest electricity. And the reason for that is that they are generating electricity out of liquids in these outdated thermal plants. Then big gains can be made in terms of efficiency there. And it's not substituting thermo-generated electricity by non-traditional renewables, but the first option should be substituting outdated thermal plants for state-of-the-art thermal plants, liquid fuel thermal plants by gas fuel thermal plants. Now the gas landscape is changing. It's changing worldwide and it's changing in Latin America, particularly in areas that never thought of gas before, like Central America and the Caribbean, because you all of the sudden have plentiful of supply of gas in the Caribbean basin, not just because the U.S. is becoming self-sufficient and may become an exporter, but Trinidad, that had as a main market the U.S., now has an export surplus that could be redirected to the Caribbean. Colombia is about to become a net exporter of gas. Venezuela will eventually, or could, Eni has huge discoveries in Venezuela, but the framework is not the right one. But for the Central American countries that most of the population lives on the Pacific seaboard, you could bring gas from Peru, which is very close by. Then that's on the supply side, and you have the technologies for transporting low-scale gas with a smaller scale LNG vessels or compressed natural gas. And then you have a small-scale gas plants. Then there are, just to illustrate that when we think about efficiency, it's not just the demand side, but huge improvements can be made on the supply side. Then answering your question, if I knew I wouldn't be here, I would be in St. Kitts, you know, if I was able to forecast the price. And that's very difficult. One thing what we can say for certain, and we tend to oversee this, is that the price regime has changed for good, and I'm going to explain myself. For 70 years, from the 1930s, with all the agreements among the Seven Sisters, up to the early this century, prices were pretty stable. In real terms, nowadays dollars were around $20 per barrel. There were these three disruptions, 73, 74, 79, 81, and again when the Iraq war in 81. You had these spikes, but these were supply disruptions, and then the prices reverted to this mean. What we have witnessed over the last decade is the combination of two factors. One is demand-driven, and is Asia coming into the market. You see China coming into the world market, and India, and that has meant a demand push that has changed the world energy landscape for good. And then you have this and demand of energy by the developing countries. It's now larger than in the OECD countries, and will keep outstripping this demand in years to come as income per capita increases in the developing world. Then you have that demand push. And from the supply side, you have run out of cheap oil. You're not running out of oil, or you're running out of cheap oil. And that has meant a new equilibrium. And that's what I say, it's an irreversible change in the price regime. Now we're entering into a new, and it's market-driven more than before. Before we had an extremely regulated market by the Seven Sisters first, then OPEC, then regulation. This country, the free trade country, had all trade regulations until the 1987, one way or the other. Now we have a much market, sort of world oil market or world energy market, and we have this new price regime. As Rob said, I see prices in a band somewhere between $80 and $100 per barrel. In the Western Hemisphere, we have three marginal producers, so areas of marginal production. The tar sands, the tight oil and shale oil in the US, and the pre-salt in Brazil. Before it was the Venezuela belt, but Venezuela belt is now below that. And those three areas will be developed with prices above $75, $80, I would say so. Then you have the interplay between demand and supply. But, and as Rob said, that's what the advocates of peak oil never somehow oversaw coming, is that the technology drives prices down. Then we move into less fertile lands, less fertile reservoirs, more expensive, more complex. But on the other hand, we have on the other hand, we have technology develops that push costs down. Then we have this permanent interplay. Now we're doing things we never thought of before. We couldn't speak of the pre-salt 20 years ago in the 1990s because we couldn't even see below the salt dome in Brazil. Now we have geophysics that allow us to see there, and technologies that allow us to drill there. We couldn't talk about developing the shale gas 20 years ago because we didn't have horizontal drilling and we didn't have fracking, hydraulic fracturing for breaking up these shale rocks. Then you have this permanent interplay. But I would say it's somewhere between 80 and 100. And I would say that would be very much the case over the next 10 to 20 years. And as Keynes said, in the long run we shall be dead. Then we don't care much about, I at least don't, for next over 20 years. Among other things, because I would have forgotten by then what I said today.
It's been recorded.
Yeah, but I would say that is the case. Thank you.
Well, this is a tremendous conversation. I would love to continue it all morning. As indicated, we don't have that amount of time. But before we close, just a couple very quick things. The first is, I am really glad you brought the supply side into the energy efficiency discussion. And that's something Christian knows, but many of you who have followed our activities from the council perspective, we've been very focused on the idea that politics intervening is making the energy market in Latin America less competitive, less efficient, in terms of cross-border power grid connectivity and access to energy for countries that should have it from their neighbors but don't because of historical political grievances or what have you. But the issue of Central America, and it's one that both the U.S. government and the IDB have done a lot of important work on, and Central American governments too, but how much that would be facilitated if our own government in the United States would more aggressively allow us to export natural gas, which we have abundantly. Mm-hmm. And you know, from a foreign policy perspective, it's ludicrous that we're not allowing ourselves to do this. And I think it's something that, from the council perspective, we've been strong advocates of. I know many in the room have too. So it's an element of preaching to the converted, if you will. But this is another example of how politics is intervening in efficiencies, and it has environmental costs, it has economic costs, it has political costs, and I think this is something that we'll continue to try to lend our voices to. and hopefully all of you will as well. I would simply like to thank, again, the panelists
Thank you.
for the wide-ranging, informed, sophisticated comments that you all made. I also want to thank again Christian for doing the lion's share of the work, and we sit up here and we get the credit, but he's the one who does the work, and so we thank him for that and look for further activities. And with that, if I could just ask you one final item of business, and that's to join me in thanking the panel for their terrific comments this morning.